The wind coming off the Potomac River carried the chill of late November through the streets of Washington. Inside the Navy Department building, lights still burned long after most offices had gone dark. It was the evening of November 23, 1942. Behind one closed door, Admiral Ernest King sat alone at a heavy wooden desk. The war had already swallowed the world, and the pressure of it rested on the shoulders of men who barely slept. King dipped his pen in ink and began writing a short letter to the President of the United States. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was just one paragraph. He wrote that he had turned 64 years old that day. Navy regulations required officers to retire at that age. At any moment, if the president wished, he could place King on the retired list. The letter was polite and almost mechanical, like the report of a man who had spent his life following rules, even while bending them when necessary. The letter arrived at the White House the next morning. Franklin Roosevelt read it quickly, smiled slightly, and picked up a pen. Instead of dictating a formal response, he scribbled directly on the same page. "So, what, old top? I may even send you a birthday present." That brief reply revealed something unusual about the relationship between the president and the most feared admiral in the United States Navy. Roosevelt kept Ernest King not because he was easy to work with, not because people admired him, but because no one else in the entire American military could do what he did. Many people wished someone would replace him. Some wished someone would do something far more extreme. Dwight Eisenhower, then working as a planning officer in Washington, once wrote in his diary that one thing that might help win the war would be to get someone to shoot King. The comment wasn't entirely a joke. The British called him the most anti-British American officer they had ever encountered. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, whose office sat practically next door, communicated with him mostly through written memos instead of face-to-face conversations. Even the civilian leadership of the Navy struggled with him. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox tried more than once to remove him from power. Under-Secretary James Forrestal drafted plans to strip away some of his authority. None of it worked. King survived every attempt, every complaint, every political maneuver. And while all of that was happening, he quietly built the most powerful navy the world had ever seen. To understand how one man could accumulate so much influence, you have to look back to the chaotic weeks after Pearl Harbor. The United States had been dragged into a global war overnight. The Pacific Fleet was shattered. German submarines were already stalking the Atlantic. The Navy needed leadership that could act quickly and brutally if necessary. On December 30th, 1941, just 23 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt appointed Ernest King as Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. That position placed every operating naval force under his command, across every ocean on Earth. King's first reaction to the appointment wasn't about strategy or power. It was about the title. The old acronym for the job was SINCLINT, but another version used within the Navy sounded like Sink Us. King disliked the way it sounded and insisted the title be changed immediately. From that moment forward, the position would be known simply as COMINCH, Commander-in-Chief. It was a small detail, but it revealed something about him. King believed names mattered, authority mattered, precision mattered. 3 months later, Roosevelt gave him another title as well, Chief of Naval Operations. That second position meant King now controlled not only the fleets fighting across the oceans, but also the enormous administrative machine that supplied them. Recruitment, shipbuilding, training programs, weapons development, logistics, every bureau inside the Navy Department ultimately flowed through his office. No other officer in American history had ever held both positions at the same time. Army leaders watched this with a mix of curiosity and unease. George Marshall was one of the most powerful military figures in the United States, yet even he did not directly command combat forces in the field. King did. In practice, Ernest King became something close to the embodiment of the entire United States Navy. His personality matched the scale of his authority. One of his daughters once described him as the most even-tempered man in the Navy. He was always in a rage. Roosevelt joked that King shaved every morning with a blowtorch. At the Naval Academy years earlier, classmates had written a warning beneath his photograph: "Do not fool with nitroglycerin." Stories about his temper spread through Washington. In one case, General Henry Hap Arnold of the Army Air Forces sent King an important memo. A typist accidentally addressed it to Rear Admiral King instead of Admiral King. 24 hours later, the envelope came back unopened with a simple arrow pointing at the word rear. To most people, it seemed absurd. To King, it was about discipline and accuracy. Yet those who worked closely with him noticed something else. He encouraged fierce debate inside his staff meetings. Officers could challenge ideas, question assumptions, argue over details. King listened quietly through the arguments, absorbing every viewpoint. Then, when the discussion had exhausted itself, he would calmly present a solution that suddenly made everything seem obvious. Many who witnessed it wondered afterward why they hadn't thought of it first. But even brilliant commanders make mistakes. And one of King's early decisions during the war nearly destroyed his reputation. The disaster began in January 1942. Exactly 1 month after Pearl Harbor, a German submarine slipped close to the American coastline and torpedoed a merchant ship east of Boston. It was the beginning of a campaign the German Navy called Operation Drumbeat. For the next several months, U-boats hunted American shipping almost without resistance. The eastern seaboard of the United States remained brightly lit at night. Cities refused to dim their lights because they feared it would hurt tourism. Hotels along the coast kept their neon signs glowing. Ships sailing along the shoreline often appeared in perfect silhouette against the illuminated horizon. To submarine captains peering through their periscopes, the targets looked as clear as objects in a catalog. The commanders responsible for defending those waters had almost nothing to work with. Patrol forces consisted of a handful of Coast Guard cutters, a few converted yachts, and several aging patrol boats left over from World War I. Meanwhile, valuable destroyers sat idle in harbors, waiting for other assignments. Losses mounted rapidly. In January alone, German submarines sank nearly 200,000 tons of shipping. By February, the number had climbed even higher. Tankers carrying vital oil from the Gulf of Mexico began disappearing at an alarming rate. The British watched in frustration. They had already fought the submarine war for years and learned the painful lesson that merchant ships must sail in convoys protected by escorts. They urged the United States Navy to adopt the same system immediately. King resisted. He argued that the Navy simply didn't have enough escort ships to protect large convoys along the American coast. Poorly defended convoys, he believed, might create concentrated targets for submarine attacks. The British insisted that even lightly protected convoys were safer than ships sailing alone. The debate dragged on while sinkings continued. Finally, in May 1942, the United States Navy implemented organized coastal convoys between major ports. The results were dramatic. Within weeks, the number of ships lost began to collapse. German submarines suddenly found themselves facing coordinated defenses instead of isolated targets. By the end of the year, sinkings along the American coast had nearly vanished. Even King admitted the truth. Escort convoys were not just one possible solution to the submarine threat. They were the only solution that truly worked. The early disaster remained a stain on his record, but what followed became one of the most impressive operational transformations in military history. King began constructing a vast anti-submarine warfare system that stretched across the Atlantic. Intelligence specialists tracked submarine radio transmissions. Aircraft patrolled shipping lanes from newly built coastal airfields. Warships escorted convoys across thousands of miles of ocean. In 1943, King created something unusual, the 10th Fleet. Despite its name, the fleet owned no ships and sailed nowhere. Instead, it existed as a command center coordinating every anti-submarine effort in the Atlantic. Officers analyzed intelligence reports, directed patrol aircraft, reassigned escort ships, and predicted where German submarines would appear next. At the same time, King introduced aggressive hunter-killer groups. These formations centered on small escort aircraft carriers supported by destroyer escorts. Instead of waiting for submarines to attack convoys, they actively hunted them across the ocean. Aircraft from those carriers scanned vast areas of water, forcing submarines to remain submerged and limiting their ability to strike. Gradually, the balance of power began to shift. In May 1943, the turning point arrived. German submarines suffered catastrophic losses in a single month. Dozens were destroyed while Allied convoys crossed the Atlantic with far fewer casualties. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, eventually ordered his boats to withdraw from the most dangerous areas. Years later, he admitted the truth. The Battle of the Atlantic had been lost. While that struggle raged across the ocean, another conflict unfolded quietly inside Washington itself. King and Army Chief of Staff George Marshall often disagreed about priorities. The Army wanted resources directed toward the war in Europe and large land operations. King believed naval strength in the Pacific was equally vital. Their arguments sometimes reached surprising levels. At one point, the Navy ordered massive quantities of copper, steel, and electronic components to build machines designed to break German naval codes. These devices, early cryptologic computers, were crucial to reading enemy communications. Marshall protested that the materials were needed for another secret project. King demanded to know what it was. Marshall hesitated before explaining that it involved a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. The program was still experimental, and no one knew if it would work. King was unimpressed. From his perspective, code-breaking machines were already delivering real results in the battle against submarines. Diverting resources to an uncertain scientific gamble seemed reckless. Neither man realized how ironic the argument was. The secret project Marshall defended would eventually produce the atomic bomb. But at the time, both leaders believed they were fighting for the most important weapon of the war. Meanwhile, King continued reorganizing the Navy in ways that sometimes shocked civilian officials. He shifted command structures, created new operational divisions, and streamlined decision-making processes. More than once, the president himself had to remind him that certain changes required approval. King usually listened. Then he found another way to achieve the same outcome. By 1943, the scale of the American naval expansion had become almost impossible to comprehend. Shipyards across the country worked around the clock, launching new vessels at extraordinary speed. Liberty cargo ships rolled down slipways in weeks instead of months. Escort carriers, destroyer escorts, and landing craft poured into the fleet. The Navy grew from fewer than 800 active ships at the beginning of the war to several thousand by 1945. Millions of sailors filled their decks. Convoys crossed the Atlantic in endless streams, carrying soldiers, tanks, aircraft, and supplies to Europe. Others sailed west across the Pacific toward island battlefields whose names would become famous. Through it all, Ernest King remained at the center of the system. He attended strategy meetings with Roosevelt and other Allied leaders, but increasingly the president allowed him to operate independently. Trust replaced supervision. Decisions that once required lengthy discussion were now made inside King's office. The transformation of the Navy continued at a staggering pace. New radar systems appeared on ships. Improved sonar detected submarines beneath the waves. Long-range patrol aircraft closed gaps that had once allowed German submarines to hide in the middle of the ocean. One dramatic moment came in June 1944 when an American task group captured a German submarine intact. Boarding parties seized codebooks and cryptographic equipment before the vessel could sink. It was one of the greatest intelligence victories of the war. Each success reinforced the growing sense that the tide had turned. German submarines were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. By the final years of the war, the United States Navy dominated both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Carrier fleets roamed the Pacific Ocean, striking Japanese bases and warships. Amphibious armadas delivered entire armies onto distant beaches. The Navy King commanded had become larger than all other combatant fleets combined. In December 1944, Congress created a new rank that had never existed before in the American Navy, Fleet Admiral. 5 stars. The honor recognized the commanders responsible for leading the massive global forces of the United States. Ernest King received the rank only days after it was established. The boy who had entered the Naval Academy decades earlier, the officer whose temper had frightened colleagues and irritated politicians, now stood among the most powerful military leaders in American history. Yet his personality never softened. He remained blunt, impatient, and often difficult to work with. Friends were rare. Admirers were even rarer. But results were impossible to ignore. By the end of the war, hundreds of German submarines had been destroyed. Allied convoys crossed the Atlantic in growing safety. American shipyards produced fleets at a rate that stunned the world. When King finally left active duty in December 1945, he had served more than 4 decades in the Navy. He spent his final years quietly, far from the pressure of wartime command. Looking back, historians still argue about him. Some point to his early mistakes, especially the terrible losses during the first months of the submarine war. Others focus on his abrasive personality and the many enemies he made within the military and government. But even critics admit that few commanders in history have directed such an enormous expansion of naval power while fighting a global war on 2 oceans at the same time. Ernest King was not beloved. He was not gentle. But in the brutal arithmetic of war, his achievements changed the course of history. And that is why, when the Admiral wrote to the President about turning 64 years old, Roosevelt simply wrote back a few casual words and ignored the retirement rule entirely. Because in the middle of the greatest war the world had ever seen, there was still one job that only Ernest King could do.